I think we're good, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please court, counsel? On a crisp January morning, nearly 5 years ago, Orlando Police Lieutenant Debra Clayton lay on the asphalt, the cold asphalt, of a Walmart parking lot mere miles from here. Her hip had been shattered by a .40 caliber bullet that was fired and entered the rear of her body, going through her bowel and her pelvis as she was struck by a shot from behind from her attacker that was chasing her. This first shot sent her to the ground, unable to run any further. Lieutenant Clayton was still armed. She had her gun, but she was wounded and little match for her still mobile assailant, who ran up to her, firing down at her as she looked up. The evidence in this case will show, ladies and gentlemen, that those were the last moments of Lieutenant Clayton's life before a second, and in fact what was the fourth .40 caliber bullet was fired into her neck and severed her carotid artery. More importantly, the evidence in this case will show that the man who chased her, who circled her, who stood over her and held the gun, fired the shots that ended her life, was the defendant, Markeith Loyd. The evidence will go on to show that on that day, Mr. Loyd committed more crimes as the day went on, as he fled from law enforcement's efforts to bring him to justice. Now, the scene that I just described to you, Lieutenant Clayton's last moments, will be uncontroverted. And in fact, ladies and gentlemen, it was captured on video. Clayton. The evidence will show that Markeith Loyd fled from police, and in doing so, crimes of attempted murder of a law enforcement officer, and then carjacking and aggravated assault of a bystander who got in his way. But to understand the evidence of what happened on January 9th of 2017, you have to go back approximately 1 month. And the testimony from the state of Florida will begin with what occurred on December 13th of 2016. State's first witness will be Detective Savelli. Detective Savelli will tell you that he responded here in Orange County on that December 13th night to investigate a homicide. Yes, yes, Your Honor. So Detective Savelli responded to a scene on December 13th of 2016. And based upon his investigation, Detective Savelli went to a judge. Judge signed a warrant for the arrest for first-degree murder, the first-degree murder of Sade Dixon for the defendant, Markeith Loyd. Now, Detective Savelli will describe to you about how when a warrant is issued, law enforcement is notified so that any law enforcement officer who comes into contact with that person will be aware of it and can bring the person into custody. But what you will hear, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, is that no one from law enforcement came into contact with Markeith Loyd prior to the morning of January 9th of 2017. So we will quickly go back to that morning of January 9th, and you will hear witnesses who will tell you what occurred at the Walmart located at 3101 West Princeton Street here in Orlando, at the bottom right corner of the map on your screen. And the primary witness that you'll hear from will be a woman named Takeshia Bryant. Ms. Bryant will tell you that she went into the Walmart that morning after 7 a.m. and it was an unusually cold morning. She had a couple of her children with her, one of her children, her nephew, and she went in that morning to buy a jacket because her nephew wasn't prepared for the weather of the day. She'll tell you that she walked around the store, quickly found the item that she was looking for, and then she walked to a cash register near the front of the store to check out. When she went to the register, the light was on, but there was no cashier present. So she and her nephew walked across the aisle to try to find someone to help them get out of the store and check out. She eventually found someone, walked back to register 2, and when she got back to register 2, there was a man standing there. He was wearing all black, with a beanie on his head and a shirt that said security in white letters across the front and back. And Ms. Bryant will tell you that she immediately recognized that individual. Ms. Bryant will testify that she recognized that individual because he had a relationship with one of her relatives, and she had seen on the news that he was wanted for the first-degree murder of Sade Dixon. She'll describe the clothing that we just discussed, and she'll tell you there was no doubt in her mind that it was the defendant, Markeith Loyd. Ms. Bryant will testify that she immediately became extremely nervous and in fact had to type the PIN number for her debit card in multiple times because she kept getting it wrong. And yet, while she gained her composure, the defendant standing right next to her, she calmly walked out of the store, and as soon as she got out of the store with her nephew, she ran. She ran because moments before, she had seen a police officer, police uniform, a black female, walk past her and out of the store to the right where her police cruiser, lights on top, was parked. And that police officer was Lieutenant Debra Clayton. Ms. Bryant will explain to you how she runs over to the car and lets Lieutenant Clayton know that the man standing at cash register 2 has a warrant for the murder of Sade Dixon. And you'll hear that shortly after that communication, Lieutenant Clayton calls for backup. She tells the other units that she's going to attempt to contact a suspect in a homicide investigation. Ms. Bryant will go on to tell you that a minute or so later, she hears gunshots while she's in the parking lot near the car. She quickly ducks down. The next time she's able to get up when the shots have ceased, she sees the man she identified as Markeith Loyd walking away, jogging back to his vehicle before driving away. Ms. Bryant will not be the only witness that you'll hear from in the Walmart. You'll also hear from Julia Johnson. Ms. Johnson will tell you that she worked at Walmart at the time and that she was walking back into the store on the morning of January 9th when she walked past a man wearing dark clothing and a black shirt that had white security across the front. And you'll hear that Ms. Johnson identified the defendant, Markeith Loyd, as the man who walked past her. Significantly, Ms. Johnson will tell you that prior to hearing any gunshots that morning, she heard a female voice yell, "Stop, get down." And you'll hear the same testimony from Keisha Bryant, that before there were any gunshots that morning, she heard a command that she believed to be from an officer to get down, to stop. Similar testimony will come from another Walmart employee named Monica Pridgeon. Ms. Pridgeon will tell you that morning she was at the Walmart. She saw whom she believed to be Mr. Loyd. She ended up seeing or hearing the gunshots, and she will tell you it is definitively her view that Mr. Loyd fired first. These witnesses will testify, and you will be asked to gauge their credibility, but yet again, it will be made easier because it's all on video. You'll see video from inside the Walmart following Ms. Bryant around. You'll see Markeith Loyd walking around the inside of the store as Lieutenant Clayton checks out from the cashier and walks out of the store in full police uniform on the morning of January 9th of 2017. The evidence will then shift to what happened after Mr. Loyd shot Lieutenant Clayton. You'll hear that he fled from law enforcement and that when officers arrived, they sent out on the radio a description of his vehicle. That's when you'll hear testimony from Captain Joseph Carter of the Orange County Sheriff's Office, longtime member of law enforcement. And Captain Carter will tell you that on that morning, a little after 7 a.m., he was driving south out of Apopka into the station to begin his daily work, when he heard the radio transmission with the description of the vehicle. He altered his path, coming out from the top left of Apopka, where he normally goes down 441, and he came down North Pine Hills Road because that was the last location that the vehicle had been spotted. And not long after he was going down North Pine Hills Road southbound, he encountered the vehicle, what turned out to be a 220 Mercury two-door coupe sitting at the stoplight of the lane. As soon as Captain Carter comes up to the light, he sees the car accelerating. He does a U-turn, turning on his lights and sirens. And he will tell you that the Mercury went only a small, short distance until it turned right into an apartment complex called Royal Oaks. Captain Carter will describe how he followed the vehicle into Royal Oaks apartment complex, and when they got to the second driveway, right, and it was a dead end. The Mercury stopped, and as Captain Carter pulled up behind the vehicle, before he could even get the door open and put his leg on the ground, shots rang out. And that a man wearing all black, a black male, fired at him. Captain Carter quickly got back into his vehicle and backed up. And again, ladies and gentlemen, you'll know that shots were fired because you'll see evidence that Captain Carter's vehicle was struck with a projectile. And you'll hear about the shell casing that was found at the scene. Captain Carter will tell you that he waited for backup and that the man who fired at him took off on foot. And you'll know that happened because Antoine Thomas will then testify. And he will tell you that he was returning to his apartment where he lived with his family in Royal Oaks just after or right around 7:30 in the morning. He had been getting coffee, and he'd driven his 2013 silver Volkswagen Passat to do it. He parks in a space in front of his apartment building, walks in, at some point somebody yells, "Hey." Mr. Thomas didn't even know they were talking to him, but what he found as he rounded the staircase and got to the first landing was a gun in his face. And he will tell you that the man holding the gun was the defendant, Markeith Loyd. And you'll hear that Mr. Thomas identified Mr. Loyd from a photographic lineup that same day. Mr. Thomas will tell you that the man demanded his keys and that he was terrified. But in the man's hands, the man he identified as Markeith Loyd, he saw a firearm with an extended magazine, and in the other hand, another extended magazine. Knowing he couldn't catch it, Mr. Thomas threw the keys, hoping that the man would have to drop his firearm to catch them. And then he quickly turned and ran to his apartment. Additional witnesses will testify, and you'll see, again, video that Mr. Loyd, in fact, gets into Antoine Thomas's 2013 and then drives over and through a fence into a separate apartment complex in and around a residential neighborhood where he, for all intents and purposes, disappears. The remaining witnesses, most of the remaining witnesses, will be forensic witnesses who will describe their analysis and collection of physical items of evidence that shed insight on where Mr. Loyd went. One of those witnesses will be Dr. Joshua Stephanie, the chief medical examiner for the Office of the Ninth Circuit. Dr. Stephanie performed the autopsy on Lieutenant Clayton, and he will describe Lieutenant Clayton suffering from 4 gunshots. The first gunshot wound went into her right leg and exited from the same leg in the front of her thigh. A second, somewhat more superficial gunshot wound was in her stomach area. Then you had the gunshot wound from behind, just above her right buttocks, that fractures her pelvis and gets lodged near her stomach. And finally, the fatal gunshot wound to the right part of her neck that ends up killing her that day. You'll hear testimony from forensic witnesses who examined and searched the Mercury vehicle that was found at the scene where Captain Carter was shot at. And they'll tell you that when they searched that vehicle, they found items of clothing consistent with Mr. Loyd's employment and paperwork throughout the vehicle with his name on it. You'll hear that eventually, on that day, January 9th, law enforcement located Antoine Thomas's Passat at another apartment complex not far from the Royal Oak shooting. And that when they found it, it was backed in to a space with pretty extensive front-end damage to it, and you'll see photographs of that damage. Officer Paul Foster will testify that he searched the rear of that apartment complex that afternoon, and there on a balcony, wadded up, was some clothing consistent with what had been described as that worn by Markeith Loyd at the Walmart. What you'll find is that that evidence, that clothing was collected. It was sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and DNA analyst Sean Johnson will tell you that he compared a DNA sample from Markeith Loyd, and it matched the DNA sample that came off of the camouflage pants found in the complex. We will then transition to the final portion of the forensic evidence in this case, which involves firearms. So you're going to hear from a crime scene investigator named Edward Vanderburg. Mr. Vanderburg will tell you that he responded to 1157 Les Scott Lane, which is the scene where Mr. Loyd was apprehended. At that scene, he collected a bulletproof vest that you'll hear was worn by Markeith Loyd at the time he was brought into custody. CSI Vanderburg will also describe locating 2 firearms outside the residence where Mr. Loyd was found. One of those firearms was a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson SVE semi-automatic firearm. The other was a 9mm Glock Model 17 firearm. Eventually, near the end of the trial, you'll hear testimony from then Florida Department of Law Enforcement firearms analyst Richard Ruth. Mr. Ruth will tell you that he compared that .40 caliber firearm to 3 things. First, to a projectile that was recovered from the body of Sade Dixon. Second, to the 8 .40 caliber shell casings that were found in the parking lot of the Walmart at 3101 West Princeton. And thirdly, to the projectiles that were recovered from the body of Lieutenant Debra Clayton. And it will be his conclusion, based upon his expertise and experience, that the .40 caliber firearm found when Mr. Loyd was apprehended fired those projectiles, those bullets, and those shell casings. He will also tell you that the 9mm Glock that was recovered fired the shell casing that was located at the scene right next to the Mercury vehicle at the Royal Oaks apartment, where Captain Carter was shot at. That, ladies and gentlemen, will be the evidence and testimony in this case. That is what we will present to you during our case in chief, indicating that Mr. Loyd committed the crimes of which he is accused. But it will not, as you probably gathered from the questioning during jury selection, be the only evidence you will hear. So I want to take a moment to touch on a couple of topics that may come up. It may be suggested to you, first of all, that Mr. Loyd acted in self-defense. Now, I'm going to be candid with you. I will be candid with you that there is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt as to who fired first, whether it was Lieutenant Clayton or whether it was the defendant, Markeith Loyd. We just don't know that. But what the evidence will show is that Markeith Loyd had a warrant for first-degree murder on January 9th of 2017. That Lieutenant Clayton was aware of that warrant, putting him into custody. And thirdly, that she gave him commands to get down and obey and come into custody peacefully that were ignored. You will then be left with the law on her use of force and asked to make a decision on that topic if it's raised. The other topic, I'm sure you gathered, is a potential defense of insanity. And it is the state's belief that the defense will rely primarily on one expert, for his expertise and opinion that Mr. Loyd was insane at the time of this crime. I would ask that you listen for a couple of facts that are almost certain to come out. First, that this expert has a moral objection to the death penalty, was paid handsomely, and almost on behalf of the defense. Second, that according to the records that he reviewed, and records everybody's aware of, Mr. Loyd was never diagnosed or treated for a mental illness until he was charged with first-degree murder. And thirdly, you'll hear from the state's experts who will tell you that they do not believe Mr. Loyd was insane, and you'll hear from a defense expert who was paid by them who also says he was sane at the time of this offense. Now, as you've gathered, there's a lot of evidence that you're going to hear over the course of the next week or two. Our request, ladies and gentlemen, is simple: that you do what you've done to this point. Listen carefully to all the evidence that's presented before making a decision, and we are confident that when you do, you'll return a verdict of guilty as charged. Thank you.
I'll tell you in just a minute. Good afternoon. This case